The Holy Gospel comes from the 9th chapter of Mark. Jesus and the disciples went on and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about on the way?" But they were silent, for on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. Well, this summer, when I was on sabbatical, one Sunday, we went to worship at my friend's church in Bolingbrook, Pastor Rockel. Pastor Rockel and her husband, Ben, are both clergy. They're seminary classmates of mine. They live in Joliet, so we get to see them quite frequently. We hang out together. Well, we had a great morning at Pastor Rockel's church. It was a celebratory morning because confirmation was happening and there was a baptism. I loved being preached to, and Pastor Rockel gave a really good sermon that morning. It was a new church, so we got to have that experience of another place and how they worship. Well, on the ride home, the kids asked, "So who out of the three of you, Ben, Rockel, myself, is the best pastor?" And I said, I quickly, no, that's not what it's about. We all have gifts for ministry. I love my classmates. They do an excellent job in serving and what they do. I'm always proud to see my classmates shine. Yada, yada, yada. It's not a competition. And then I said, well, pastors can be competitive. I heard the phrase this summer about rubbing elbows and bumping egos. And yeah, that's sometimes the way it can go when pastors get together. In fact, we went to another friend's church this summer while I was on sabbatical. I wanted to hear her preach. Unfortunately, she was on vacation, so her colleague preached. And frankly, I thought it was a bad sermon. And on the ride home, I critiqued it, and I thought church kind of felt flat. And I thought, well, maybe it's because we didn't know anybody there. We kind of got there late, so we were sitting in the very, very back, and it was a very long church. And then I thought, well, yeah, maybe it was just flat, and kind of thought of oh, this is how I would do this better. So I confess that to you, my brothers and sisters, that competitiveness comes out in me as well. And where I'm not as competitive with my closest friends, someone who's further from me, that kind of can get triggered and stepped up. Well, I recalled all this as I was thinking about the disciples' discussion of who was the greatest. And I just wonder what that argument looked like. Did one of them say, well, I handed out the most bread and fish when Jesus was feeding the 5,000. And then that person kind of blamed another disciple who sat down because he was hungry and he just ate instead of worked. Or I wonder if Peter was extra proud because he knew that Jesus was the Messiah, while others were saying, well, you got that wrong. Remember, Jesus kind of yelled at you. Or maybe the tax collector in the Gospel of Mark, he's called Levi. Maybe he thought, he was the greatest because he had gone from tax collector, liar, and thief, and now he was this disciple of Jesus. Who knows what that conversation was like for them as they tried to figure out who was the greatest. But it wasn't a competition, but they made it one. Even when Jesus told them that suffering and death was the end of the story, not victory, not glory, they still argued over who was the greatest. And really, in light of Jesus' prediction of his death, that seems pretty shallow. But as I imagine the disciples' conversation, I wonder about those fears and insecurities that might have been behind what they said in that argument. It's that classic human struggle in which we hustle for worthiness. That hustles in all of us. 100% of us probably at one time or another wonder if we are enough in some way, and so try to prove ourselves. I know that in myself. But that competition doesn't really get us anywhere. In fact, it can bring out the worst in us. Now, the other thing in our gospel story that is at play is that Jesus and the disciples lived in a time where there was this patronage system. A patron was someone who was in a higher class, had more resources, and a client was in a lower class who relied on the patron to have his needs met. In return, the client was obligated to do favors for the patron. This was all very hierarchical. That mutual obligation was always there. You gave something to get something. Favors never really canceled each other out. So there was always, it never became equal. They just always kind of owed someone. This was just the way of being in relationship. So when Jesus tries to set the disciples straight about greatness, he calls a child into their circles and says to welcome a child. The shock of this is that the value of the child in that kind of system was zero. Nada, nothing, zilch. That child could not return any favor. And that child really represented the least of these, anyone who couldn't live up to this patronage system. So Jesus is asking the disciples to welcome, to care, to love, to embrace, to honor someone for which they will get nothing in return. And that, in that day and age, would have been absolutely shocking. And even more, Jesus is showing them what greatness looks like. It's not victory and glory. It's last place. It is service. It's not trampling your way to the top, but taking that last spot and serving the least of these and serving them with a heart full of love. I think the power in this is what it reveals to us about God. That God is not transactional. There's nothing we do to earn God's love or favor. There's nothing we do to get our ticket into heaven. It's God's choice to welcome and care and love and embrace each one of us, not because of who we are or what we do, but simply because of who God is. God is love, and God is grace, and we are God's choice. And how much does this just blow our minds? One, that life is not a competition. We don't have to prove ourselves enough because God has declared us enough. And two, that in a world where so much of our relationships are transactional, that we give something to get something, this relationship with God, this love of God is unconditional, truly and completely unconditional. And I hear in that the sense of freedom. We are completely and wildly free in this love of God. Free from the competition, free from the insecurity and fear, free from that hustle for worthiness, free from some fear that we're being punished somehow. And it might be a lifetime of work to believe that love and trust that love so wholeheartedly that we can stop those voices that ring in our head of telling us anything different. But God's love is a love that claims us and holds us and embraces us our whole life through. And I think it's in that freedom of that unconditional love where we can do this work, or where we can understand Jesus' way of greatness that looks like last place instead of first, and welcoming the child or the least of these, and nurturing with love and serving with hope. Thanks be to God. Amen.